Hi, welcome to Klig's Kitchen here at the Yarra Valley Living Center. Today we're going to make some gluten-free herb and cheese scones. Now we're vegan, so that's going to be a bit of a challenge for some of us. You can adapt this recipe, and as I go along, I will be able to explain to you how you can adapt. So I use a choice of 3 different flours. I used the buckwheat flour for the flavor that the buckwheat has. I used white rice flour, and I'm going to be using a little bit of spelt flour. Now for 12 to 15 good-sized scones, you'll need to have 3 cups of flour. Very simple recipe, very few ingredients, and very little prep. And might I suggest, if this is your first time to make scones, which are easy enough to make by themselves, but if you go on the Google search, ask Siri, Alexa, just look for lemonade scones, or even better, 3 ingredient lemonade scones. They are so easy to make, and the best part is they work every single time. Light, flaky, delicious. So that's what we're going to be making today. Light, flaky, and delicious. So let's get started. In my bowl, I've got my 3 different kinds of flour. The second ingredient, most important, is the baking powder. Now for the baking powder, I usually use a really high quality baking powder because I'm very fussy about how my product comes out. And my rule of thumb is 1 teaspoon of baking powder to 1 cup of flour or dry mix. So that goes in. And salt, I'm sorry folks, but I always use my fingers for my salt. So I just go, this is about 1.5 times the recipe, so I just do about 1.5 pinches of salt. It would come out, if you're measuring, to about 1 teaspoon of salt. I go a little bit lighter on the salt side because I'm going to be adding a couple tablespoons of sugar. So this will help to cut almost the little bit of bitterness that the spelt flour has. You won't necessarily need to do this if you're using all-purpose flour. You might want to do it if you're using wholemeal flours, because they have a tendency, once they're baked, to be a little bit on the bitter side. So it just cuts it, just that edge, and doesn't affect it doesn't over-predominate the food. So I'm just going to mix those dry ingredients in. And now for gluten-free baking, this is a trick. We use xanthan gum. So again, for 3, the rule of thumb is about 1/4 teaspoon for 3 cups of flour. And this just helps to bind the dry and the wet ingredients so that you get a really good quality, because the flours tend to be a bit on the dry side, even though you add liquid. If you add too much liquid to rice flour, you're going to get basically a globby kind of a mess. So this helps to leaven the flour. Now, because they're herbs, I've chosen marjoram, fresh, and rosemary. And I had a little leftover thyme. So I've chopped that up and just give it a little mix. And just put in I don't know how much that was, sorry. I like the biscuits herbed, and when they're fresh like that, it really, you can't do too many. Now, if you cannot find the fresh herbs and they're not available, you can always use the go-to mixed herbs. And you can just put in a little bit, maybe I'd say probably 1/2 teaspoon for 3 cups flour because when it's dried, they do become quite predominant in the flour mix. Right. I'm going to use a vegan cheese. It's called vegan cheese, and this one that I selected is just simply a pizza shred. And there's also another one that's in a block, but you can also just grate a block of the cheese. You should be able to find them they're readily available again in the cheese sections. And you leave a little bit left over so that you can do a little decorating on the top of your scones. Okay, so that's basically it for the dry ingredients. One of the things that makes the scones a little bit different than making other different breads is the fat. So the fat that we're using today would be the dairy substitute. We're using a brand called Nuttelex. And the second difference between the scones and other breads is how you mix the fat into the flours. So I use what's called a pastry cutter. It has rounded edges, but they can be quite sharp. You wouldn't want to grate yourself on it. And this is a very handy tool in the kitchen. You can actually use it as a little whip. You can use it to cut in the flour and the butter together. If you don't have this, not to worry. As long as your butter or dairy alternative is cold, then you can just take your hands and just mix in the flours and the butter together. And you want to do this until it's quite crumbly. They say in different recipes, they say to look for small pea-sized pieces. And so you can put fresh blueberries in. And when you put fresh blueberries in instead of the mixed herbs, for example, you'd want to add a little bit more of the sugar. It's optional. So this is about what you want, that kind of crumbly look. Now, the other thing that I really like to do almost consistently in everything that I bake, and because we don't use eggs, is I add lemon juice to my dairy alternative milk. And I usually give it a little bit of a whisk just to get it nice and light and foamy. Now the lemon juice will react with the baking powder to leaven the batter or the dough. A lot of ingredients call for eggs. We're vegan here at Yarra Valley Living Center, so we don't use eggs, so I compensate. I use lemon juice. So this is coming together, and it will pull together by itself without too much mixing around. Right. So this is a bit wet, and that's fine. I prefer to have it a bit on the wet side, and then I add a little bit of flour. I'm going to need to do anyway on the board when I'm making so I just have a little extra flour here. And I use this other tool. This is very handy. It was in the $2 store. It's just a little plastic device that will easily clean up messes. So you see I can pull away. See how easily the dough is pulling away from the side? And then just anything that's dry, I can easily just mix that in together. So I'm just going to take, I believe they're called a scraper. So I'm just going to take about this much dough in my hand. This will probably give me 4 scones. Put it on my board, on my floured board. It's good to as much as possible. It's better to have less flour, but I know how to work with it. So you're just going to take it and just basically kind of give it a little bit of a toss around, give it a little love. So I'm just going to shape it into a round ball and just give it a little pat down. Some recipes call for you to take a rolling pin, but I find with the scones it's really better just to keep it as kind of natural as possible and as loose as possible. So I'm using a biscuit cutter or cookie cutter or scone cutter, but you can also just use a glass, whatever size you want. But the thing about using the scone cutter is that it actually cuts the dough, so it leaves a very good defining mark. Very important to put it on your baking sheet that it doesn't have anything on it whatsoever. You want a completely dry baking sheet. So we're just going to continue in this way until all of the dough is finished. Just keep putting them on the tray, and then we're going to pop them in the oven for about, altogether, I'd say 15 to 18 minutes. And again, it depends on your oven. You want it in a fairly hot oven, a fairly high oven, just about maybe 185 in a fan oven, probably 175 in a convection oven, or in a regular electric, I would probably put it as probably 190 in the electric. For about, I'd check them after 12 minutes and then maybe turn the pan around depending on your oven. But the standard is about 15 to 18 minutes for the scones. And you want them probably at the bottom part of your oven, as close to the bottom as you can, and that makes the bottom go nicely golden brown. I've just heard the timer go off, so that means the scones should be done. Let's see if they're golden brown. Lovely golden brown on the bottom, a little bit browned on the top. And about the cheese, it is an option to sprinkle it on the top before you bake. I have found, however, that when I put the cheese on the top, it doesn't really melt very well, so it's better inside the scone. Nice and flaky inside, golden brown on the bottom. You can tell the flakiness because it just literally, the inside would just literally fall apart, or it should fall apart. And just a note that these scones, because they were made with the gluten-free flour predominantly, then they're not going to be rising up really high. So the go-to for that is you'll just, with your cutter, you'll just cut the dough thick, and then when you cut the dough, it'll rise up a little bit more than that, and so then you'll get something more along this line. But still, they've risen very nicely. So thank you so much for joining us here in Klig's Kitchen at the Yarra Valley Living Center, where food is nutritious, thoughtful, and delicious. Join us next time.